Looks like we're good.
Yeah, so it's getting connected to YouTube, and now we are live.
Nice.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to interview Lance Amato, partner at Canoa Supply. He has amazing experiences in the whole architecture journey, and I can't wait to interview him because we gonna talk about the business side, about Canoa, the development, and all the stories that led to Canoa today. So thanks a lot to do this interview.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So can you briefly walk us through your professional journey till date?
Oh, briefly. Oh boy, I can talk for 3 hours about it, but I will give you the as brief as possible. I was educated in architecture, University of Miami. It was the early 2000s, so I was actually born and raised in New York. And when I moved to Miami for school, I had the choice to stay in Miami, focus a lot on urbanism and say multifamily residential. At that point, they were building a lot of towers in that city. Or move back to New York, where the focus in New York was either you're doing superstructures of skyscrapers or a lot of interior architecture, because obviously Manhattan has limitations on land. So interiors and the constant flipping of that interiors work was very predominant. So I chose New York and started in a small organization called Conan Architects and kind of tested the market. So I was doing interior architecture for what we used to call office space and workplace at that point, but it was more commercial. And I bounced around a little bit earlier in my career, as most people should, to understand what they want to do, right? So I did a workplace. I went to hospitality, understood the methodologies of flipping suites and units, healthcare, and the retrofits of the kind of aging hospitals in Manhattan market and retrofitting those areas and putting them actually back to code. And then actually went to another firm where I got to focus on exterior base building architecture, doing core and shell work. And so I got to test the market a little bit, understand where my passion lies. And maybe I was a little too impatient for spending 5 years on a building. I am very impatient. There's no maybe to it. So I decided to stick with the interior architecture route, stuck with the firm for that, and actually went back to the firm I originated at called Conan, which eventually became acquired by a company called Vocon. That's where I spent a predominant part of my career, Conan into Vocon. And at Vocon, I kind of escalated the position there. I started as kind of a senior project architect, went to become a studio director, and then principal of the New York office. And at the time around where we kind of hit our stride was around 2013, 2014, where we kind of shifted our business methodology from doing one-off opportunities in the commercial market to approaching companies that were more youthful. I'd say trying to approach new markets of co-working and scalability. And that's where we kind of exploded. I actually had my first interaction with a small company at the time called WeWork, which had, I think, 6 locations and a team around 30 at that point. And, had a great interview with them to represent them as an architect of record in a couple of projects. And then kind of exploded. Went from doing one project to conclusion. I think we did 375 projects with them, and we learned how scalability worked and how to build interior architecture off repetition, consistency, and we adapted that learnings towards other companies that were scaling. And so Compass residential real estate was another one that came across in 2015. And a very different type of business, but similar aspirations of trying to scale and grow. So we learned and adapted and moved from there. In 2017, it was really interesting because we were so experienced in the co-working market, and the ability to do that type of work, that when the landlord market on both coasts, East Coast and West Coast, we're starting to feel the pressure of trying to compete with the flex office environments that were steadily growing. They engaged us towards unique pre-builts, which was a lot of fun. It was really interesting doing a lot of unique pre-builts and constructions. But as I will say later on in the story, I would say building pre-builts is a roll of the dice, and you're building hard-coded construction that may or may not be demolished when a tenant actually who wants to move in that space decides what their program would actually be, which started to weigh on me a little bit because we were continually building hard-coded walls and everything for permanency for a tenant and a client. We had no clue who was going to take it. And so I kind of shifted my mindset a little bit towards approachability of how interior architecture actually is and has been traditional for the last 30 years, how we build and demolish so easily, how a term in life of a space we assume will be forever, but in reality, it's for 3 years, 5 years at max. And a lot of the materials that we actually do go to waste. And before I transition into the Canoa story, it was about 2018, 2019, where building definitely started to, I started to feel that burn, started to grow towards maybe there's something different. So studies towards, I'd say, adaptable architecture, prefabrication, assemblies, and kind of modularity came into play. And it kind of pushed me and gave me a gentle nudge into where we are today.
Awesome, Lance. There are a lot of takeaways from your answer. I was just like absorbing like the whole journey, and like, there is a huge potential for sustainability, and like, if we take that like interior aspect in the design phase as well. So I want to know, like, since you have this much experience, many times as young people, like we face the challenge that, okay, I got this experience, should I continue in this company and grow, or should I switch company? So like, were there such moments where like you were questioning like about shifting the job?
It's funny because if you were to ask me this question about 2.5 years ago, I would say, stick with it, stay with it forever. But the reality is, and this is a piece of advice someone gave me, you should always stay with the place where you feel that your time and value is of best utilization, where you feel you're learning. And if you as a human, you as a professional don't feel, and I mean like there's good and bad times in every company, but if you feel like you're not applying yourself to your best value, your best time, you're not actually learning something of success, it might be worthwhile to actually exploring something else. I think for me, one of the monumental shifts of why I decided to move and kind of leave my career of being a principal of an architecture firm and shifting towards tech, we're doing now, was the aspiration is that there was a point where it was just very repetitive, that every single day I just felt like I was doing the same thing over and over again. I didn't feel like I was applying myself of true value. I would give the energy I could, and the same energy across the board. I wouldn't necessarily be lackadaisy about it, but you have to feel like you're growing every single day. Point when you don't, it is time to kind of explore and find new means and avenues to educate yourself and grow.
That's a great piece of advice. And you mentioned that you were working with WeWork in around 2014-15. Is that a point where you started, like you met Federico and working with?
Yes. So Federico is CEO of Canoa. He was at the time owned a company called Case, which still to this day is a very familiar brand. A lot of people are aware of what they did. And at that time, Federico and his partners were working with WeWork on a lot of the transitions of BIM into making the BIM models scalable for WeWork, because WeWork was at the point in the position to grow from the 6 to 12 to 300 locations. And so the case group was very, very embedded into what WeWork was doing. And so at the time, Case was doing the documentation on the development of that, and I was on the side of representation of buildings and permitting and code. And it's a very funny story, which Fed hates for me to tell, but I'll still say it anyway. Fed has this way where he definitely his interrogation mode sometimes, where he likes to like feel people out. And so on behalf of WeWork, he interviewed me as a representative of an architecture firm, and I was on the train going to DC to walk WeWork locations, and it was very interesting. He interrogated me. I gave it back to him a little bit. We became friends, and I think I've known Fed for nearly a decade now. We've worked together when he became head of design globally for WeWork. We worked together in the approachability of new cities, introducing them to what co-working was. Because remember, at the time, the only co-working company that was out there was Regus. And they were very successful what they did, but densification, true densification really at that point wasn't really there. So, they would fly me to these cities to introduce densification density to municipalities and code officials, and finding strategies and ways to actually build those spaces out at well, not only at scale, but at speed, because the level of time they wanted to open a space up from start to finish within 20 weeks.
I see. So it was like a lot of travel during that time.
Yeah, I mean, I was there was 1 year where I was on a plane 26 weeks straight, and I was just flying from city to city. And they would call me when I was, in Seattle and say, "Oh, we have a space in Denver. Can you go over there tomorrow?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure. I'll just hop on a plane and check it out, and then I'll hop back in the plane and head home." And my wife hated it. She was, she was home every single week. So, but she stuck with it. But it was a ton of flying at that point.
Got it. And so that was around WeWork time, and then Fed left WeWork.
Mm-hmm.
And then like what was like the story when like there was a gap in WeWork and Fed was starting and you met him?
Yeah, so I mean, knowing Fed, I mean, I met Fed back in 2013. We've always stayed in touch. I think Fed left in, hopefully I get this right, I think 2018. I think. Yeah, it was 2018 when he left, and we stayed in touch throughout the entire time. I remember this, this phone call that he gave me. He used to shoot me out decks and business plans of what Canoa was becoming. And I remember we had a coffee. We were walking along the water one day, and he's like, "Oh, we should just do this. We should just do this." And at the time, I was still at the company previously. He's like, "Just do this. It'd be great." And kind of, we had our feeler moment where we worked together on a strategy for kind of modular architecture. We were approaching a company that was highly interested in it, didn't understand the guidelines and basics. So, we kind of worked together to strategize a package, and we presented together, and it worked really, really well. At the time, Canoa was really focused on reclamation and sustainable decommissioning, which we still are today. But I'll tell that whole story in a second. But after we left that meeting, he texted me. He's like, "Oh, we're a good team." And, he knew where my head was at about sustainable architecture and approaching it. And then it only really took a couple of weeks later. We're like, "Okay, let's just do this." And myself, my other partner, Ellie, a few others, we all kind of corralled together within the same 2 months. And that's when Canoa really started becoming from 2 people into the scale we are today, and kind of really took off where we're going.
Awesome. And I think that sounds quite exciting and interesting phase where like was there like you met in New York, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So how what's the major difference? I think you said briefly about the initial idea and the idea which is right now.
It was interesting. So I would say a huge group of us started in like June 1st of 2020. This is during COVID, which, at the time we all thought, well, like, yeah, COVID's going to be done by September. No big deal, right? Yeah, whatever. That's obviously didn't happen. But in the early days of what Canoa started, genesis of that was reclamation of existing product. I mean, to be frank, there's an inventory of commercial product throughout the United States that is unchecked, unknown. No one knows what they have in their space. And so much stuff, still to this day, based on that continual lease turnover that I talked about before, just gets discarded, thrown in the trash. I mean, there are warehouses upon warehouses of products, and I'm not only talking about furniture, but we can just say furniture at this point, that just sitting there in boxes that after a certain point will just be like destroyed. And so the instant of what Canoa started at was the inspiration of, let's take that product that's sitting there, it's perfectly good, and resource it for another life. And then after that, another life, and after that, another life. And a lot of our research earlier on, around June, July, August of 2020, I'd say validated the fact that no one knew what they had. And there was a genuine interest about people understanding what they had. But at the point of when we were having that research, COVID was really escalating to the point that the people were hesitant to invest purely on that of just inventory because they didn't know what they were doing, right? And they still don't. A lot of people don't know what they're doing. So when we started that conversation with them, we realized that the true passion for circular economy and circularity, it has to be there. But a lot of the inset, we were skipping ahead too far, was that of planning. The planning approach of giving the tools, digital tools, to allow end users and customers and clients to understand what they have in their space first. The ability to digest through floor plans and digital inventory, first and foremost, would be intriguing to customers, and then leaning towards the planning tools that we've developed, pushing forward towards the aspect of reclamation and inventory and second life later on down the line. And really starting from the top of how do you plan a space? How do you understand the space you're planning? What does the space look like? What do you have in the space? How do you reclaim the space? Where does that product go? Was a step-by-step, because we were starting here, but we realized we had to start here and scale down truly to be end-to-end from start to finish.
Got it. And like I have seen like the demos on the Twitter, those look very promising. So this might be a good time if you can show us a demo of Canoa. The product is very promising. I have.
We are super excited about it, and I do have to give kudos to our engineering team. What they built in the aspect of, frankly, since February of this year into now, is nothing short of astounding. Let me share my screen. Okay, this one.
And you guys also made the decision to go fully on web-based.
We did. Yeah. Because in realization, and this is a misunderstanding a lot of people don't kind of get, is in AEC communities, CAD and Revit are extremely predominant. But the problem is that customers, and I mean like most customers, unless you're really your own dedicated AEC team embedded within customer base, does not have CAD or Revit. They will not pay the subscription service for that. The tools they utilize, and again, this is based off research, was that they take JPEGs and PDFs, and they use Paint sometimes, Microsoft Paint, to plan out spaces pre-engagement of the architecture community. I mean, it's pretty rough when it comes to, I'd say, using true dimensionality towards that. But that's why we went to cloud-based, to give a tool that is relatively uniform that anyone can utilize and collaborate on. And again, since our tool is not utilized today to build space, it's not a construction documentation planning tool. This is a decision support, evaluation, understanding of your interior space and what you can do with the tool. That the fidelity of it does not need to be to the 1/8 of an inch accurate. It needs to be clear enough and valid enough that you can make proper decisions, but not to the point that you're going to use it for filing documentation. All right, so let me get started. And I'll try to make this kind of as brief as possible, but also kind of hit some key points here, which is kind of what we're very excited about at this point. But the Canoa dashboard and our platform, what we developed, is a tool that we use ourselves. And we also, I'd say, give out in subscription-based services towards customers. But we use it as a tool and means and methods to design, inform interior spaces, and utilize it for adjustments, as well as deployments of interior spaces. The aspects you're seeing here are modules. And they're not every single module is done yet. Because as I mentioned before, the feasibility, the initiation, start of a project is where we want to go. And as we scale and we grow, moving into 2022, it's these modules on the left-hand side, hopefully you can see my arrow, are going to grow. And there'll be more and more as they come down. This is more version, I'd say version 2, and what we have currently to release. But going back to where we are now, using the tool and understanding it, one of the first and foremost, I'd say, critical directions that we wanted to approach something is the aspect of feasibility. And the thought here that throughout the United States, when designing something, and when, again, remember, this is not an architect or necessarily an engineer utilizing this tool, but when designing something, you want to understand whether the things that you're implementing within this space are code compliant. Now, building code in itself, this is specifically for interior building code, is a very complicated nature, and it's very, very in-depth. But what we had done, and what we have on record to date, is 1,200 jurisdictions across the United States, and the current code books that they utilize for interpretation of building code. And there are a lot. We have digitized and basically cataloged 102 different code books across the United States as it applies to interior building construction, fire egress, and travel distancing, plumbing code for quantities and counts of toilets and urinals and sinks, and energy code as it applies to energy load draws and things of that nature. And so the aspect is, before any initiation, any setup of spaces and design tools, you're going to automatically trigger and understand the building codes as well as their dimensional and unit data as you add this location to your space. Adding a location is very, very simple. In the data that we have and we built out, we also, if we have it, can review and reclaim zoning guidelines, understanding parcel data when it comes to zoning. And this is not something that's, I'd say, overly unique. A lot of companies do this, and we know this too, probably through prior research. But the reality is outside of major cities, zoning and the parcel that a building is situated on is really, really important to understand, because sometimes you cannot have your business actually occupy a space based on zoning data. So we really wanted to actually get zoning as clean and clear as possible. So at least that triggers within it. At the inset, basically, what we're doing here is once you address a location, and I'll go back here for a second. We have a bunch here as we go through. You can you now have kind of your portfolio of your location, and this is kind of where it comes into the next step. Now that you have registered the feasibility of the code and the zoning, your location, you have all that dimensional data into it. It goes into, and I'm going to add a new one into it. Oh, maybe I should actually register my account. It goes into the next step, which is truly the foundation of not only the instrument of design, but what will be the instrument for inventory and flexibility. And that is that of tether. We call it internally tether, but on our portfolio page, we call it layouts. And this is that cloud-based tool that you will see on Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And this is basically from scratch. I will do a demo of this. From scratch, basically, you have as many iterations of layouts as you choose to have. You pinpoint and add the location that you had registered. I will do this. And you can, if you choose to do so, or cannot apply a program to it. And I will explain that in just 2 minutes. But I will apply a program to it. So that actually goes to, okay. What that basically develops is a kind of a blank canvas for frankly anyone to utilize. And as I mentioned before, many people don't utilize CAD or Revit in the design tools. What they're issued and given, especially end users and clients, are given PDFs or JPEGs. And so the aspect is you can add a JPEG or a PDF very simply. You can manipulate and drag and drop it. But most importantly, you can actually scale the space. So you can just make it 3 feet. And since I love everything to center, I will drag it here because that's my axis point. Let me move you over a little bit. And so basically as an end user, most important thing is, okay, so does my space fit? Is it per code? What can I do with it? So many times you're given suites or spaces. Oh, whoopsie, I set my scale again. Give me a second. Let's not set my scale again. You're given kind of a suite or a space. So you just kind of want to work a little bit around what you have here. I just kind of set a scale parameter saying I want to work with this suite. And you're automatically triggered your square footage. Now, one of the I used to get back in the day is, hey, I have 10,000 square feet. What can I fit? And so taking a momentary pause of what we're going here, the reason I applied a program to this layout is that in our tool, not only the programs that we develop, but any program based on the logic we've developed in our engine, you can create your own programs. Some companies have their own custom per square foot or unit counts needed. They need to apply to square footage to actually prove out their business would work. In this case, we actually are applying a preset demo-based program to this. And to answer the question, how many people can I fit in 2,247 square feet? It actually applies towards what we have here. And I'll show a little bit more in that as we go forward. But also, now, as we have applied the location to as well, the actual code books that are applied to this space, including its use group, are also now attached to this. So knowing the numbers first, having the code, and starting to define your space and understand what you actually can fit. Let's say I want to fit 49 people as a goal. It's multi-tenant floor, sprinkler, great. Let's add an exit. Now I'm going to add, I'm going fast, So probably not going to be wholly accurate. We're adding doors, we're adding stairs, and all this information can be gathered through, dimensions and arrows and points here. Adding toilets, and that can read in plans. And system calculations come in a future date, but electrical outlets and rooms and such. When you apply all those things, you're actually going to have a trigger. Whoop. You're going to start to have pinpoints and triggers. Remember, we're trying to approach customers that are relatively unfamiliar sometimes with the compliance engine, that you're going to start to actually have a checklist to ensure that you're inputting the right information prior to even putting pen to paper, to make sure that based on your target occupancy, you actually have, you can even initially meet your allowable occupancy based on code. So we actually have a compliance engine that pulls off in tabs here. But really where the magic kind of happens is once you start to have a space and you defined it, you have your occupancy and your counts, you can apply elements. Or basically what this is spaces of scale. It could be a room, could be a desk, could be a reception desk, could be a light. It's whatever we consider or you consider elements within your own catalog or kit of parts. And so, you can add within your own library catalog a bunch of elements to your design tool, and then you can start to just drag and drop it on. Oop. Oh, whoops. There we go. Drag and drop it on. Hey, hit the button, Lance. To start to define rooms and spaces within it. Now, the start of this is, the thought here is that if you are a company that is scaling, you do have preset parameters of like an office or desk or things of that nature. You have set standards. So as a customer, you can actually add your own spaces relatively quickly. And I'm doing it not so design oriented, but relatively quickly within your own kind of environments, and start to implement and design and lay out those tools. Distancing, snapping lines, zoning. See how we also have overlaps for controls of that, all come into applications and all being evolved more and more. The understanding that you can actually, copy and paste zones, the triggers that involve into developing the space, all are getting built in with this environment. Now, this is the implementation of the space. The reason I keep bringing this as a foundation of the space is that once these tools are implemented and laid out within the space, the intention or goals towards moving towards next year is that now we have this space full of flexible products and tools within the interior environment. And let's say a customer wants to get rid of this. They could potentially request the decommissioning of this environment, which would come through as a ticket or a communication tool to us to get rid of. Or if they want 2 more desks, they can add that in there too. Or if they actually just want to move it themselves and shift it, they would be given the tools to know whether they can actually move it or shift it around. With that being said, you're giving flexible units of physical space in digital form, 2-dimensionally, towards these people, and starting to give them their own kind of ability to manipulate, collaborate, and adjust, and know what they have in space. Because at the end of the day, there is an inventory schedule of all the units that they have within that specific environment and suite that they now understand. Now, I'm putting in kits of parts, which are a compilation of a bunch of products. You can also have physical products, which are just one by one. Any questions so far?
No, I'm just loving this demo. Great product.
Yeah, we're super excited where it's going to go now, because everything we're showing here in this specific layout is that has been constructed through modular architecture. We're not doing hard walls at all. And as we approach, and as customers approach us for new spaces, I should actually show you where we tag outlets, but we go into a space, we study the space, we scan it, we tag the existing outlets, or we are approached and requested to build new. But everything we do is based on the fact that everything is plug and play. Everything is modular and flexible. So this room, this desk, this unit, this kit of parts can be disassembled and moved somewhere else if you chose to do so. So all the partnerships we have, and I'll show you that in 1 second, of all the products that we as a company use to develop interior spaces is that of modularity and assembly, and not so much hard wall construction. With that being said, there's one thing I do want to show you. Let's go back. And then let's go to Oop, oopsie, hit the wrong button. Sorry. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Is that of the inventory. So one thing, every item and element that we project out within that space is tagged to a product within a catalog. And the catalog itself is its own database of, I'd say, sustainable products and inventories that we have. This is for us. Any customer can create their own catalog of parts and pieces, their own agreements and understandings of how much they've negotiated their pricing, things of that nature. But what's really interesting is as we move forward into the development of space, we're adding in elements towards carbon data and embodied carbon. And we're also adding in energy usage. So as we take steps to develop that space, and as products and elements are being tagged in, when you deploy it within the environment, it's going to start to add up those elements. So, and you know, it's a very, I'd say, embodied carbon. The study of that is it's its own world, its own story. Let's be honest about that. I'm not going to answer your question about that, but the reality is, at least it's a start to understand what you've done in terms of development and deployment of a space, in terms of that embodied carbon, and having understand it. And in the inset, you know, it's one more further step ahead of that of just not knowing it and doing something two-dimensional in CAD and then keeping your fingers crossed and studying it later. So we're kind of pushing forward towards the automated understanding of environmental impacts as you deploy a space and you reclaim it back, as well as the efforts to push reduction of energy usage within the interior environments and really setting the bar to keep that as low as possible. So that is kind of where I'd say it's kind of the main parts of this. The next approachability, what we're doing, is that of inventory and asset tracking. Because now that we are physically putting an imprint on the world, we are now tying that of the physical products and the inventory of the physical products back to platform. Again, going back to the point that no one knows what they have or where they have it. So being able to, you know, I don't like to use the term too much, digital twin, but understand as a user, as a customer interface, knowing what you have, when it was installed, you know, its year was built, its overall kind of, I'd say, quality, and whether you want to claim it is kind of the next steps. And eventually, it is the second life and the tracking of that kind of going back towards that.
I have a question. So regarding sustainability, so when a user makes choices about like the interior furniture products, at that time, the decision making of, okay, do we have other sustainable options of chair which has lesser embodied carbon energy, and the inventory part which keeps tracking so one can reuse it in other projects, is the whole aspect how you cover sustainability?
I'd say it's definitely more than that. First, when it comes to the encouragement of interior environments, our ethos and many interior architecture is 80% hard construction, 20% movable products. We flip it on its head and we say it's 80% movable and adjustable and 20% hard construction. So offering solutions that have prefabrication and assembly towards that is the first step in that of saying, hey, everything you deploy within a space has a second life and not to be discarded trash. And at the quintessential use of sustainability, diverting something from landfill is a huge priority from us, right? Now, the embodied carbon studies, as we grow and move forward, as we push this forward, searchability of understanding the embodied carbon based on products overseas or manufactured, as well as the location you're deploying it, is something that we're going to be growing and pushing forward. So the answer is yes, you would understand the impact that you have forward. But it's not, I'd say, while it is a core aspect of what we're trying to do, the biggest part of this whole approachability is, hey, we're using materials you can take with you. Oh, by the way, when you're done, we want it back. Like, don't get rid of it. And we're going to take it and move it somewhere else and push it, or potentially recycle it. And so it's taking what is the traditional aspect of a very short life cycle of a hard constructed space and saying, we're basically, I would say forcing you, but strongly encouraging you to think using assembled products, knowing the impact you have, and then truly making the study to decommission it sustainably. So that has a second life as we go forward, leaving a very little impact on the actual interior space that you've built. So that space is prepared for the second tenant and the third tenant and the fourth tenant.
And that is super, super interesting, because I was just thinking, like, let's say one tenant leaves the space and that tenant wants to like get rid of some furniture, and maybe there is another tenant in the same building or other buildings in New York. So you could also direct those resources to new tenant who is planning. And the modular aspect is being done in like right from the design and planning phase itself, where you place different modules. So
it can go many different ways. In some of our studies, in actual projects, for one, the resourcing and reallocation of physical commercial furniture, it's a market people sometimes don't really assume and approach in the beginning, but it's there already. The interesting part of this is that, and something that I have a personal passion about as we're growing, the resourcing of construction materials for second life, extremely challenging. And I can tell you, resourcing and finding new homes for commercial doors, commercial lighting, acoustical ceiling tiles, carpeting, and rugs, it's its own super, super big challenge. And to be honest, almost all of that goes to trash. And so, when we go and approach a space, we try our best to recycle and strongly, again, I say strongly encourage the reclamation and sustainable decommissioning of spaces. But I think the first step towards anything is don't actually build something that can't have a second life to begin with. And it's a challenge, but we're trying our best.
Great. And I have like some idea, but I just want to clarify, like, who is your target customer and what phase of the design you expect this product to be used?
I know that's like the quintessential startup question. Who's your target customer? It really is a balance. The realization that we have a core emphasis right now working with landlords because of the short term of the lease, working with them to help develop the physical space, that it has that second, third, and fourth term for leaseholders. But in addition, the flexibility of the interior space, that collaboration tool, we have found has been very successful and strong interest for opcos, those that actually approach a flexible market and truly want to attain the ability to manipulate interior spaces. Could be co-working companies, flex office. I'd say even occupiers that have a strong interest in leaning towards that. We've seen a definitely increase of that. But in general, and we've been very, very open about this through LinkedIn and Twitter, we don't want to be so siloed in our thinking. We want to offer the tools to designers and and offer the ability to say, hey, we can actually, when time comes and actually when you use it, use our tools for your own purposes. You can use it for your own clients. You can use it for your own customers, and offering the tools for them as well. So we're trying our best to kind of not only find the tool, the market and the customer that will use it to build and deploy the space, but finding the aspects of, as well as the end users, the design teams that would use it as apply for their own customers.
Got it. And during the demo, I was just thinking, I wish I had this product during my architecture design studio, because it could like also have like behind the scene, it's doing like providing like a holistic approach of sustainability and embodied carbon, which we generally do like at the end or like do separate analysis. So like those kind of tools are really helpful for also students to get trained how to think about sustainability in first place.
Yeah.
uh, I'm curious to know, how do you conduct user research and testing out for new features?
That's actually a question. So very first and foremost, we actually had a very robust research effort, even before the iteration of version 1. So what you saw was version 2. So last year, the research was all across the board. We were talking to, I'd say, the key stakeholders of the development of interior spaces, brokers, end users, project managers, architects, interior designers, all those natures. So like I mentioned before, we were initially going to start with the inventory portion of this. We've learned through the flexibility, the platform is a foundation. But as we researched that, it kind of leaned us towards the initial inset. Now we are that of the ability for collaboration between, I'd say, the designer and the customer. So and you can see it on LinkedIn, we've offered kind of frankly free early subscriptions to customers to begin that market research. And we strongly believe the only true way to evolve our product is to expose it and evolve it. So people that definitely come in, they know it's done, they know what's actually early access, and we actually are looking for that input to push forward. As we've all probably read in books and such things, probably the biggest mistake you can make is to build a product for like 2 years, then release it and realize no one wants it. So you kind of want to attain that information and that constructive criticism through the evolution of your product.
Got it. So one of the ways is user testing the product and giving you feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And like, are there any like survey forms or one-on-one interview you conducted during the early phases?
We did. So we did one-on-one interviews, several of them last year. During the implementation of data usage, the things that we actually portray on the product page, for example, that I had showed you, we sent out online surveys, which help prioritize what data points would provide. And that head of product actually was the one who initiated that spearheaded that part. So through those points, through our own internal networks, using LinkedIn and Twitter, we went out there and said, what's relevant to you, what's a priority, what's nice to have. Eventually led to the data points and the inputs that you had seen on our product page. And we do that regularly to make sure in the building of any product, we have some basis of understanding what the customer would want. But then again, I think user input's really critical.
Yeah. And if you don't mind sharing, like, what were some key findings based on those research?
Oh, well, outside of the key findings that no one knows that they have, I think it's hysterical. We also found in the early decision support, and people may disagree, but this is a pretty strong iteration. Early decision support, many key stakeholders deciding what they want in the space and whether the space can fit, found that three-dimensionality is not the priority, actually. Truly programmatic fit and financial fit takes priority over three-dimensionality when it came to decision support of space acquisition, not the design of the space acquisition, which actually very strongly shifted our mindset for the initial inset of doing a two-dimensional cloud-based platform over three-dimensionality. That was through a lot of research and a lot of understanding. And that actually really shaped and molded what Tether, or what we call layouts, came to be. Two-dimensionality was our focus, but the embedding of code and the ability to tag products with that two-dimensional product was a strong interest of the end user over the three-dimensionality of it.
Got it. And I know like you showed the code compliance feature, and I can only presume how challenging it is to get it working. Like, can you tell about like
we built that? That was a story. I don't know how much time we have. I'll be quick, but basically, code and adoption of code is a well, first off, code compliance in municipalities is extremely dated. There are people that still use printed books to enforce their code. So we had to manually research and validate every single city. And it's not over yet. We're not done, because code is constantly readopted, that we have to manually scrub and go through every municipality again, over and over and over again. Some interesting feedback came out of it. I wrote a couple articles on Medium. Some discouraging points about how old some people use code books, how old the code books people use to enforce their code. But I would say it was a manual research input. It took a long time to do.
I see. Yeah, because I was reading about like few tech startups who were like digitizing the building code. There were challenges, like the building is code sometimes is constantly updating, and there are lots of building code to cover, and there are also like legal things to take care. Like,
yeah, we all know who you're talking about, but I'm not going to say it just for the purposes of listen. We love what those guys are doing as well. I think democratization of code is very important. We are, after all, trying to do our best to build something that is safe as possible. So allowing everyone access to it is very important. Like, it shouldn't be something that is restrictive in nature. And some people will disagree, hopefully not, but I would say it is the digitization, the interpretation of that is also really important too. Ensuring that there is a digitization of information and democratization of that. Another step is that of interpretation as it applies to a project. So I would say there's some challenges here and there, but it's something that is totally feasible and can, to a degree, be automated to give you some level of understanding what you have.
Yeah, and one major like observation I have, like many times like tech products helps someone totally new to reduce the barrier to entry in that field. So for example, good cameras in our smartphones enable like everyone to be a good photographer. Similarly, I think like code is a big barrier. What if someone who is interested in architecture but doesn't have architecture background or degree? Like if there is a code compliance feature like that, then it encourages more people to like get into architecture and maybe just test out that field.
Yeah, I mean, it's not only that of I mean, I can tell you, I have walked spaces that people have occupied that like furniture is blocking fire exits, and there's this stuff that is not compliant. I've walked through, I mean, a sea of desks where electrical outlets are being, triggered. There can be a fire concern all in all. I mean, if there's some level of tool to understand whether, what you're trying to do within your interior space is at some level compliant, it is a huge step up from not knowing at all. And frankly, I think, AEC wants to be in front of everything and always answering that question. But the reality is they're not. They can't be, because businesses are businesses. They will run their business as quickly as possible, and they want to add 3 more desks. They're going to do so. We need to provide them the tools to ensure that they actually have their desks even in the appropriate spaces, or frankly, knowing that what they're doing is not as compliant for fire, and it's imposing a risk on their own tenants and their own occupants.
Got it. I have like one final segment about the finance aspect of the startup.
Mhm.
So I'm very impressed. Like you guys started during pandemic and did some fundraising. So can you share us like how the initial phases were? How did you manage funding? And
No,
what was your meetup with the venture capitalist?
no. It's I'm gonna give you as much information as I should. Yeah, we have 3 wonderful VCs. So, with that being said, I the raising through COVID, people say is either, I'd say, the most courageous, the dumbest thing you can possibly do. But in talking to our VCs, and we engaged many of them, we understood the AEC community and building space itself is really pertinent and focused to, I'd say, a group of individuals and venture capitalists that understand the market. There's so many different aspects of VCs out there. There's general VCs, there's AEC specific VCs, tech VCs, things of that nature. And during the time, obviously during COVID, physical space was always a challenge. Like building space was a challenge. So the ones we actually really truly engaged with had a strong interest, one, in the aspects of, I'd say, ease of engagement with customers, but a lot in sustainability, because what they're seeing through all of their own conversations is this massive shift of, I'd say that physical space will always exist, but the way we approach a physical space has to change and be more sustainable as we approach towards it.
Got it. And so you said you had like AC VCs and other tech VCs. So do you like change your pitching deck accordingly to the VCs who are not well aware about AC?
Yeah, I mean, you have to approach it in such a way. And we did what we call a pre-seed. It's kind of a pre-seed or seed round. I'll get a slap on the wrist, but we always kind of flip-flop between what we call it at that point. I used to guess we call it kind of seed round at that point. But yes, the answer is yes, because the way you engage a building-based or sustainable-based VC is very different than that of a general VC, because your language and your vocabulary has to change. So the decks you're building, it's not because your company is any different, but the explanations and the critical points of segments that you need to focus on definitely change between those two. Not so dramatically, but at least those that you're explaining it correctly, they understand it.
Cool. And this might be a bit obvious question, but I'm curious. So how do you decide when to approach for another round of funding? Let's say you have some resources, you can survive for 6 months, or you can double up your team and get it done for 3 months and raise another round. Like how it's driven for raising more funds?
So we internalize our own our goals or our KPIs. And we try to achieve those KPIs. We kind of know it's kind of that point. For us, as much as we'd like to say run out of money, raise more, we don't like to think that way. Justification of our business approach and the establishment of what you just saw was a critical KPI for us. And in doing so, it gave us the comfort to say, hey, we've achieved these specific goals, these goals that would make us feel comfortable enough to approach the next round into growth. The establishment of your business case as it applies to your market segment was one of the biggest goals of our seed round, to ensure that we had validated our product correctly. And we do have customers, which is wonderful. And we have growing customers, which is also wonderful. Hitting the targets of the customer segments, the appropriate customer segments, as well as the appropriate points that we've developed in our engineering, is kind of the metrics that we follow through to say, hey, maybe it's time to take this to the next step and to grow the team into a degree that we can move forward into our Series A, if we choose to do that.
Got it. And if I'm not wrong, like people say like 1 in 10 startups survive and there's like high percentage of failure. So what are some common mistakes you observe in startup, and like how do you plan to be more successful?
I would say there's a couple, and I've talked to startups as well. Sometimes I get a little nervous about their own business methodology. For one, always adjust your business case, your business approach, even your pricing structure. Evolve, take all of your inputs and data points into greater success. We've tried our best to evolve the business structure as it applies to the market segment instead of just sticking with one thing over the course of the year. And that kind of led us to what our current pricing structure and subscription base is right now. That's definitely one. For two, get input, user input. But like I said before, building a product and without any input or any user feedback could be monumentally bad. And pushing forward, listen to your VCs. To be honest, they talk to hundreds of people, more customers and companies, and know the market segment is really, really important as well. And generally, just like don't be afraid to evolve, even push forward. Like I said before, validating through research and data is truly important, and shifted kind of where we were started into where we are today.
Got it. And do you have like any advice for scaling business? Like it could be like from your experience as a principal or in startup area.
There's a lot to that, but I would say, for one, one thing I definitely learned earlier in prior career was obviously know your team, your skill sets, and always lean towards clients and customers where you know that the team's skill set will best apply and find great success. And specifically for the architecture world, we had a very focused, I say, customer base that was youthful, growing startup customers that wanted to scale. And so we targeted that. And I mean, that was our target basis. We explored and researched and experimented with other customers that kind of knew who we were and were willing to push forward. We never really broke out of our mold outside of our one or two experiments and learned from there. Now, sometimes those experiments grew into a different market, hence the pre-built market. We kind of pushed forward. We did an experiment with a landlord. It went well, so we just exploded towards a landlord market. But we never really tried to break into healthcare or hospitality or do labs or I'd say mission critical spaces, because even though technically we could have done it, it was not within our comfort level, or I'd say it was a little bit too much out of range to go after without prior research. And through that scalability, having your customer base and that kind of growth, it just naturally, the company grew with us. The same resides in our startup today, is that of, we know our market segment and we're very honest with our customer, who we are and what we do. Sometimes we don't actually fall within the customer interests. So we're honest about it. We are willing to experiment once in a while, but we know the segments we want to go after, the ones we're strongest in, and those are the ones we go after and kind of grow from there. Don't chase after everything is kind of what I'm getting at. Kind of, I'd say, organically grow your company based on your core strengths and understand what's an experiment and what's not, and then know it's an experiment, and as well as the customer to understand it too.
Guy, that's a great piece of advice. I have a few light questions to end the interview. So how does a day in your life look like?
Interesting. A day in my life. So one of the great things, we are a remote first company, which gives us a lot of opportunity to have flexibility. So, honestly, I have very unusual hours, just because being remote first also gives me opportunity to spend time with my daughter. So I get up kind of super early. I crank away. I usually correspond with our head of engineering based in London because of time zones. So, in the mornings, early on is a great utilization of efficiency. And then I take a break, handle time with the kid, get her ready for school. She goes off. I work. And then again, she comes back, take a break. In the evenings, it's kind of this weird shift. But what's interesting also is, there's on and off days, because even though we're remote first, there's a huge request and requirement for physical interaction. So while we're remote first, we also physically visit spaces. So we kind of flipped on and off times. That middle point of the day could be, physically going to a site, and kind of seeing what's going on within the space, or physically meeting people too. Because within any type of actual constructions or interior architecture, you need to also have that point too.
I see. And what are some books which it could be architecture, business, startup, like which had a big impact in your life?
Oh my goodness. There's a couple of books. I think there was one book that I read many years ago after I was exhausted. Like basically, I think I was exhausted because I had a fight with a customer or client as an architect, and I went for a drink with a friend. And it started me on this path of thinking differently. And that was Commercial Real Estate Revolution by Rex Miller. And it kind of taught me the aspect of truly what a different means of practicing architecture could be like. At that point, that book was focused on something called IPD, which was and still is, I'd say, a relatively unique practice outside of healthcare construction. But it drew an interest in me towards, hey, as an architecture firm, you can be incentivized to make a space better. You can work with a team in the inset. Not everything needs to be so transactionally based or so step by step by step. There's new ways to do stuff. And that kind of opened my eyes up towards kind of the new ways of doing work. And ever since then, it kind of never went back. I just kind of flowed with it and kind of pushed forward.
Got it. Which city or country are in your to-do list for travel?
I want to go back to Italy. Definitely. I've always loved Italy, and it's one of my favorite places to go. London is also one of my favorite cities, and I'm going to get out there at some point, whenever we can get out there. So, I'd say my to-do next year is to have a proper, visit to Italy, and probably have a long weekend in London. That's what I want to do.
That sounds fun. So anything which we didn't cover in this interview and you want to talk?
No, I mean, I'll say this. I know the basis of viewers are young professionals, mostly in AEC. And I would say this, that this is actually a piece of advice, not only outside of people that I know, but there's such a broad basis of what defines AEC nowadays, that many people assume that working for an architecture firm is the only way to go. And not that I would dissuade anyone from working in an architecture firm. I worked there for 20 years and I love the experience. But there is a huge diverse market out there now, that there's a blend of technology-based companies that offer products versus just customized interiors, that blend aspects of technology, metrics, and business approaches over architectural practice and business approaches. And so when you explore and understand what you want to do, the limitations of just working at an architecture firm, I had, I wish I had actually explored a little bit more and learned a little bit more to bounce around. Bouncing and understanding those two kind of different approaches, and actually learning both of what an architecture firm does and how they practice, as well as how tech companies based in AEC practice, will actually round out your career and understanding of how both worlds work. Because there still is a split. There's a split of tech versus traditionalism of AEC, and they're going to sync up at some point. But being the professional and learning on both sides of things will help you, give you a broader understanding of truly how this industry is going to have to shape and mold pushing in the next 10 years.
That's a great piece of advice, Lance. And I really enjoyed this interview. Thanks a lot for your time to do
Thank
this.
you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Have a nice rest of your day. And I'll let you know if I'm in New York and we could.
Yeah, definitely.